professor at Evangelical University. You can't hear? I don't have a mic. Maybe you can shut the door. Yeah, thanks.
Oh yeah, close the door.
Or move up front. I can get louder, so just let me know if you can't hear.
I would move up, but I have to leave early, so
okay. I'm the National Program Director for Sabeel now, which I'm very grateful for. This workshop is going to talk about two types of Christian Zionism. And I have grown up and evolved through the two. So some of this is, me working out my own autobiography, my theology, and whatnot. But I'm going to approach these in terms of really how they support the narrative that we just heard critiqued, and how biblical and theological and church belief surrounds the old narrative that Israel is pressing forward and Zionism is pushing, and gets churches and faithful Christians kind of stuck in that position. And I certainly was. Now, I'm not going to have time to talk about some of that personal journey, but I'm going to just try to give you the essence, and I might have to move through this quickly so we have time. Father Alona, do you have a watch on? Could you give me a time signal at 11:30? So, thanks. Okay, and David is going to help me with moving. We didn't get the remote, so he's going to do the remote for us. Okay. So, here's the outline. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction of the status quo of what Israel's present position is. And I don't have to spend much time because you just heard a brilliant expose of that by Miko Pellet. That was worth your registration fee and more to get that amazing analysis and his own personal journey. Then I'm going to move to the evangelical fundamentalist type of Christian Zionism. And I've written a book, I've written a lot of articles, and I sometimes go too long on that one, so I'm going to have to cut that one a little bit shorter. And then, very few people are talking about the mainline Protestant and Catholic form as a form of Christian Zionism. But that's the case I'd like to make for you. So that's basically what I'm going to put forward. And then there's I'll leave a slide up with some of the resources available. Okay? This is what's happening in reality to the West Bank. It is basically being carved up by the Israeli army and by the plan. So the Palestinians are being given, Mitri Raheb, a pastor in Bethlehem, says, we are getting the holes in the Swiss cheese. And then we're surrounded by the Israeli military and the infrastructure and the settlements. We are going to be surrounded and live in these little Bantustans, and that is what our future is. Totally controlled by the military and by Israel. And I just want to get a little bit about what the reality is. Okay, next. So that's the map. This is the Kalandia checkpoint. I have gone through it many times, some of you may have. And those who have to work, say, coming from Ramallah, have to go through this every day. Or if you're coming from Israel, from Jerusalem, and need to work at Ramallah, you got to go through. And it's like going through cattle chutes. The humiliation is unbelievable, but the mechanism of control. You'll hear a little bit more of that tonight from Jeff Helper, an Israeli analyst, and he'll be giving the keynote. But that's the humiliating daily journey of many Palestinians on the ground. I encourage you all, how many have been through the checkpoint? I encourage you to consider going on a witness trip, we call it, with Sabeel, so you can be a witness and make up your own mind about what's happening and experience and see it firsthand. Many of the tours that are organized by many of the pro-Israel groups don't show you this. so you get kind of a very benign Holy Land experience. But we try to show you both sides and let you make up your own mind. Okay, next. This is some of the humor, but a very sad humor that the Palestinian community in Bethlehem put up. Merry Christmas from the Bethlehem ghetto. Bethlehem is now a ghetto, analogous to the Warsaw Ghetto. Surrounded by a wall, surrounded by the Israeli military, and many people can't get out and get to Jerusalem. And when you go and visit Bethlehem, and please do, and then stay in Bethlehem. Most of the Holy Land tours that the churches go on come through this, and they take a little dip in and let you go into the church and the nativity, and then you get right back on the bus and you come out and see the rest of the Israeli version. You don't meet the people, the living stones, as 1 Peter talks about the church. You don't meet the Muslim community. You don't experience a beautiful hospitality, but you don't see the reality of what's going on. Okay? Netanyahu, with an interview with Wolf Blitzer, who comes right out of the pro-Israel lobby, by the way, with a lot of softball questions, says we're maintaining the status quo. But the status quo means what you just saw: occupation, humiliation, apartheid, as Miko described it, so we don't have to spend much more time on it. This is the status quo that Netanyahu is pushing. Zero interest in a just Palestinian state, so that Israel, with U.S. help, has now killed the option of a two-state solution. So we are left with one state with democracy and rights for all. But the status quo is Israeli control. Jeff Helper calls it the matrix of control. You know, he uses the analogy of a prison. You can control the whole prison population by controlling about 2% of the land space. If you put up the bars, or put up a wall, security checks, and an army around them, by controlling just part of the land, you can control the whole population, the matrix of control. So this is what the Palestinians are getting, and more settlers. Okay, so let's move to, well, I'm going to skip this one. I'll just mention it. Netanyahu met with a Texas Christian Zionist congressman the other day, and he said, David Ben-Gurion says that we have been given the right to this land by God, and he pulled out the Bible. And this congressman just loved that. And then he vilified Obama and the Obama administration and Christians who may challenge the narrative that God gave everything to the Israelis, you know, the land and so on. Well, we don't believe God is in the real estate business, is not a land deed grantor, so we challenge that narrative. But this is very political, but it's steeped in a lot of evangelical and fundamentalist theology. So I want to give you just a little bit of that now, okay? So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to briefly summarize these two forms of Christian Zionism that are rampant in America, and then show how they really are impediments, if not undermining, the case for justice, a just peace. So I'll look at two of them very briefly. It's not extensive, and hopefully I'll have time to unpack it with questions. Okay? So first, the evangelical fundamentalist. I grew up in an evangelical, and I would say a fundamentalist background. I grew up reading the Schofield Bible. How many know what that is? A few of you grew up with that, which basically has a hermeneutical outline that was developed in 1909 by a theologian, Schofield. And in it, you interpret all of the Bible according to what's called a dispensationalist timeline, where we are moving to the end of time toward a rapture and the ultimate return of Jesus. And in as we get into the final stages of that struggle, Israel will become the dominant arena for God's activity. And God has blessed Israel for these final days. And through these final days, Israel will be the nation that rises against the Antichrist. So we can unpack some of it. But that's the narrative that leads to this kind of theology, the land deed theology. Okay? I'll say a little bit of that now. The evangelical community is very large, at maybe 90 to 100 million Americans. It's the fastest growing arena of Christianity. And the evangelical movement is a kind of a branch moving out of the Second Great Awakening, post-Civil War in this country, which takes the Bible very seriously. Some are literalists, others are not. It emphasizes the atoning work of Christ. It believes in the second coming of Christ, and so on. But there's many, many branches of that. And one branch is the fundamentalist. There are two types of fundamentalism, but I want to talk about the dispensationalist branch, which really began to emerge in the 18th and the 19th century. So I'm going to develop that a little bit for you. Okay? Next. That branch, the dispensationalists, believe they're called the premillennialists. The Schofield Bible divides all of history according to different dispensations. And like there's the dispensation of law. And that means humanity will be judged according to how they keep the Torah and law. This next dispensation is a dispensation of grace, that humanity will be judged by God according to how they believe in Jesus Christ as the Savior. And it goes on like this. It's a very simple, black and white analysis with a lot of problems. But as they move that history along, they say that the church is only here for an interim period. This is where it is very antithetical to the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. The church is an interim. And when do you think the church ends? The dispensation of the church and of grace? Let me take a guess. Some of you dispensationalists who grew up here. No. It ends with the rapture. Who said that?
No.
You got it. The rapture is a symbolic idea in 1 Thessalonians 4. It's basically a symbolic text. They make it into a literal future event. And they say that Jesus will come on the clouds and call up the true believers, and they will be removed from history and be translated into heaven. This is absolutely antithetical to New Testament teaching, but it's dominant in this theology. So the true church, and that's those who believe like they do, they will be removed from history, and then God will be working through Israel in the final events of history. So the church is really a minor interim idea in this theology. It's low ecclesiology, almost no ecclesiology, we would say theologically. So then, the rest of us who are left behind will have to make a choice. The Antichrist, who is the devil incarnate, will rise to power. When I grew up in this, they were always trying to figure out who was the Antichrist. When I was a kid, for a while, it was the Pope. Then it became the Soviet Union. And you know, when all these disappeared, then it became the European Union. Because there were initially 10 nations, then when they got more nations in Europe, they were taking from the book of Daniel the 10 toes of the empire. Then they had to find a new one, and then it became the Soviet Union and Gorbachev. And he had the birthmark on his head. They say, that's the mark of the beast. So you see how they take verses, literalize them, and try to create something that fits their theology. Now the Soviet Union, when it went down, today it is militant Islam and it might be China. Any, or the UN, any of the enemies of Israel. And they will form a global movement, attack Israel. In the final days, there'll be wars and tribulation, and Christ will come in the middle of this to intervene on behalf of Israel and those who choose Israel, to stand with Israel. So you can see how this theology can be easily politicized into support for Netanyahu's project. And Netanyahu is a friend. He has played with this for 30 years. He's very close to these fundamentalist leaders. So that's just a thumbnail sketch, and a very poor one. Now, this is very deep in American culture, and here's just a couple of points that some of these are old figures, but they still have relevance. 33% of Americans polled, got people in town, said the Bible is inerrant. Now, what does inerrancy mean? Literally true. Everything is literally true. So when the Bible has symbolic language, you know, like the bird descends on Jesus at his baptism, there's an actual bird sitting on Jesus' shoulder. Meanwhile, symbolically, that is the Holy Spirit, or peace, symbolically. But they interpret that literally, just as they do the rapture, which is this is a symbolic text from 1 Thessalonians 4. 46%, this is higher now, claim God promised Palestine to the Jews. All of Palestine, by the way. Next, 66% of those polled said Jesus will return soon. 36% expect it will be in their lifetime. Jesus' return will be within our lifetime, according to many. And, oh, hit down one more. There's one more down here. 59% believe the rapture will be an actual historical event. So this is contrary to biblical teaching through history. But this theology has seeped into our culture. And you know, the Left Behind series, the 12 novels, that popularized this movement in an incredible way. And it keeps being generated by a lot of the televangelists. Okay, let's go on. I'm going to have to skip some of these. This is, I got to get another slide of this guy because he's a very dear, loving person. But he was one of the architects of this theology, John Nelson Darby, a renegade breakaway Anglican from Ireland who began to publish and develop this theology. And he is the one who brought it to America in 6 mission journeys post-Civil War, and it got caught up in a lot of the theological movements of evangelical Christianity at the time. So people like Dwight L. Moody in the Moody Bible Institute got the theology from him. And Moody was not a dispensationalist in the beginning, but he took that doctrine, and the rapture and the end times became dominant in his theology with the influence of Darby. So there's a history to this. This fellow is a fellow Chicagoan. He is the one who really popularized this with a little novelette called Jesus is Coming. And it was all this theology in a very popular form. Bump it down. It was in about 1878. 1878, Jesus is Coming. And this was a New York Times bestseller in that day. But it gave articulation to this whole theology at a very early stage. He organized the first pro-Zionist lobby in this country. And he was a Christian layperson and a very wealthy one. So in 1891, he organized a petition. You know, this illustrates how this theology goes political very easily. He organized a petition to the then president, and it was funded by John D. Rockefeller, by Charles Scribner of the Scribner Publishing House, and many wealthy people. And they had full-page ads in newspapers from Boston to the Mississippi. And they took thousands of signatures to the then president asking for a Jewish state in Palestine in 1891. He had governors, members of Congress sign this petition, and it was very powerful. But thankfully that president said no. But there is the first lobbying effort in this country, even before the World Zionist Congress, the first Jewish Zionist Congress is organized. This is before. Okay? When is the first World Zionist Congress? 1897, Basel, Switzerland. This precedes it. But really, and it collaborates and paves the way for Zionism, this kind of a movement. Okay? Now, I'm going to skip along a few of these to save time. Lord Balfour was brought up in this. He was brought up in this theology but in the Plymouth Brethren in England. And he believed that, that Zionism was really a prophetic movement, and that England would be blessed by God if they support Zionism and create a Jewish state. So he was also a colonialist, imperialist. His main goal was political, for the empire to control, the region from the Mediterranean over to the jewel in the crown. What's the jewel in the crown? India. So he wanted a land bridge. His primary goal was political. But he was predisposed to the Zionist movement because of being brought up in these beliefs. So there's Lord Balfour, and there's the Balfour Declaration. This gives Zionism its first international legitimacy by a major power. That His Majesty's government really basically supports a Jewish state. They don't even mention the majority population, the Palestinian Arab. And at this time, the Palestinian Arabs were 90 to 91% of the population.
He was foreign secretary?
He was prime minister. Oh, he was foreign secretary, exactly. I'm jumping ahead. Anybody know who the prime minister of this period was?
Israeli?
David Lloyd George. Lloyd George was more phonetically Christian Zionist than Balfour. He was brought up in this area. I read an account and of some of his advisors, and they said, we could not get him to understand the names of the cities and the towns in the Holy Land because he only knew the biblical names from reading the Schofield Bible. And we could not drum into his head what the correct current politics were in the names of the cities and the areas. He was so predisposed to Zionism because of his Christian background. That's the prime minister. So again, I don't argue that Christian Zionism made the Balfour Declaration sign. It was a clever, kind of lobbying effort by the Zionist movement. But there were these other forces from Christian Zionism that predisposed these leaders to take the side of this hardline Zionist position. Okay, now we're going to move a little quicker. Now we'll skip this one. This just shows how in 1948, when Israel became a state, and this supports Miko Pelled's narrative, you had Christian, mainly fundamentalist Christians saying, this is a miracle of God. That now Israel is the state. This proves the Bible is correct, that Israel will rise in the latter days and become a state. So they weave in their theology around the political events. Okay? Let's get, well, let me just mention here. In the late 1970s, you had an evangelical president, Jimmy Carter, elected. He was supported by many who would support an evangelical or fundamentalist theology. But then Carter proved to be a different breed of evangelical. He believed in human rights. He gave a speech in March 1977, shortly after he took office, where he said, the Palestinian people deserve a homeland. He didn't even say state. a homer. And I have a friend who helped draft that, who was in government with Carter. He said that was not in the text we gave Carter for that speech. He added it. He wanted to move things along. Immediately after that, full-page ads were taken out in the papers. I have a copy from the Chicago Tribune. There's New York Times, Boston Globe, all the way across to Los Angeles. President Carter is going against God and the Holy Scriptures because he will divide the land and is opposing Israel's right to control all of the land. So the religious right, with the moral majority and other groups that were emerging, went after Carter. And this was a break, you know, with of the conservative movement with the Democratic Party, and a shift began during this period. Carter really lost the election, mainly because of Iran. The economy was down, but this was a factor. This issue became a factor. Okay, let's skip ahead. And then we got, who comes next to the presidency?
Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, we'll skip that. We got Ronnie. Reagan himself was very much a Christian Zionist. He was very ill as governor of California, and a couple of evangelical fundamentalist ministers came to his bedside and began to teach him this dispensational theology. One was the Reverend Harold Bradison. Another, Hal Lindsey, wrote The Late Great Planet Earth, which was an amazingly impactful one-volume summary of Christian Zionism. And that book influenced a whole generation of fundamentalist young people. So Reagan began to believe this end-time scenario, and that Israel was privileged because they are God's chosen people. And if we don't stand with God's chosen people, Genesis 12:3, anybody know how does that verse go? Yeah, it is, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Falwell would use this all the time. If we begin to get even a little bit of critical of Israel, or challenge Israel's right and claims to this whole land, God's going to turn against us as a nation and as a people, and we will go into decline. So that's how this theology becomes a political tool and undermines really a just and peaceful settlement. Reagan used the idea of Armageddon at least 6 times publicly. He believed we are in the last days and we must support Israel, right or wrong, or we will go down as a nation. Okay. I gotta watch the clock here. Just a reference here, a lot of work has been done to show how from the late 60s and especially in the 70s in Carter's presidency, there was a shift in the Bible Belt away from the Democratic Party over to the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And this took place gradually, and Reagan consolidated it during his rule. Okay. And this guy, George W., became the most pro-Israel president that we have seen. Now, he technically, we don't know, he technically was not a Christian Zionist. We don't know that he believed in the rapture and Armageddon and all that. But what he did do, he galvanized that right wing with Karl Rove and merged it with a neoconservative ideology. And that became a major power base for his election and then re-election. And of course, they were tremendous advocates for Israel and for war in Iraq and beyond. So, the New York Times, over 40% of his votes in 2000 came from the fundamentalist evangelical wing of Protestants. And that represents that shift that took place in the 60s and 70s and migrating over to the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Now Romney's got to figure out how he can galvanize that. You know, some of them have little problems with Mormons. And there's a lot of other things they have problems with Romney. So I don't know that he'll be able to galvanize all of that, but Karl Rove is certainly trying. Okay. Reverend John Hagee, he has risen to become probably the most prominent spokesman for the fundamentalist form of Christian Zionism, and it's a highly political form. He's from San Antonio, Texas, 18,000 member Cornerstone Baptist Church. For 2 decades, he has supported the settlements. He has a night to honor Israel, where he will turn over a check from $1 million to $1.5 million of tax-exempt contributions that usually go to the support of settlements. We passed resolutions in the Presbyterian and the Methodist too to begin to challenge this. That if the settlements indeed are illegal by international law, they should not be tax exempt from U.S. donors. So, but this has yet to be really ratified. Now, Christians United for Israel is organizing in every state in the country, and I'm sure they're in Albuquerque. They have nights to honor Israel, but they put out political diatribes against any politician who challenges the pro-Israel narrative. And they mobilize on behalf of AIPAC. They work hand in glove with the major Israeli lobby, pro-Israel lobby in this country. In fact, the leader, David Bragg, comes right out of AIPAC, and he is the director. He really runs Christians United for Israel. Hagee is kind of the figurehead. So let's move to the next slide. Here, they put out an action alert when they thought that the U.S. might support the Palestinian Authority's move to be recognized as a state last year. So they put this out in every state, and it's issued in churches, in many of these churches. Tell Obama, we must demand that our allies and all recipients of U.S. aid must join our opposition, and it's to a Palestinian initiative in the UN. The President must commit the full diplomatic might of the United States to opposing any such resolutions. Obama must send a clear message that we will not reward the Palestinians for their obstruction and violation of past commitments. I mean, talk about spin. Ask the President to oppose UN recognition of the Palestinian state. It only takes a minute to stand with Israel. So there's a clear expression how this theology and this movement becomes political in a very direct way through Christians United for Israel. And this is a serious challenge because this represents millions of voters. Okay, now let's move on. Oh, that's the wrong way. Let's get on to, well, I'll just mention this. There are a number of these fundamentalist churches, this one is from North Carolina, where they are raising funds and then sending some of their members over to work on settlements, all tax exempt. And this is another one of the challenges. Many churches of this movement support settlements with tax exempt contributions, but with workers who go over. And then they come back and they become evangelists for this type of theology and this political movement. So we really have our hands full on this side of things. Okay, well, this just summarizes some of the concerns. This Christian Zionist movement is extremely Islamophobic. You know, Islam is now one of the enemies, and it's viewed by many of them as of the Antichrist. But the rhetoric that is coming out against our Muslim sisters and brothers really needs to be challenged because it is absolutely evil and heretical. So that is a concern. I say it's inherently anti-Semitic, this movement. You know, in the end time scenario, after In the midst of the tribulation, the 7.5-year period at the end of time, when Israel will so-called be attacked by the forces of the Antichrist, 2/3 of the Jews will die. That's what's taught. A dear guy, gosh, I'm blanking on his name, wrote a book called The End of Days. Gershom Gorenberg, a wonderful Israeli writer. His book is about this whole issue. He was then interviewed on 60 Minutes, and Bob Simon asked him, well, why do you think your fellow Jews and Israelis support this movement? You know, if they believe that 2/3 of you are going to perish, I mean, isn't that something that you want to challenge? How can you work with them? His answer was wonderful. He said, well, I know their theology. It's like a 3-act play. The problem with it is that in Act 1, 2/3 of us Jews perish. And then in Act 2, the rest of us have to convert to Christianity or go to hell and perish. He said, as a Jew, I don't like my chances. So he summarized it quite well. He said, you know, it's a matter of convenience. The pro-Israel lobby gets millions of donors and political supporters by pushing this theology and encouraging it. So they don't really care what they believe. If they're going to give to us, and they come and bring tourists when no one else will come, including Jews when things are tense. So they're a major economic stream, but also a major political base of support. Okay, so I'm going to have to go on and speak very briefly. Well, we'll skip that. Sabeel has held a conference on this, critiquing it. You can get the literature, you can go on the website. And the Christian bishops, all the major Christian bishops, including the Catholics, the Lutherans, the Episcopal, and now some evangelicals are claiming this is a heretical theology and is dangerous to our very survival. I say it's anti-Christian because it undermines the future of Christianity, not only in the Holy Land, but in the region, and good relations with our Muslim and Jewish sisters and brothers. It's a fear-based heretical theology. Okay, let's go on. I need to be, there's hope in the evangelical movement, and I'll just get that too. Now, in the mainstream, nobody is talking about the mainstream Protestant, the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Roman Catholics, as another form of Christian Zionism. But I think we need to begin talking about it in that way. And some of our prominent liberal theologians, like Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Paul Van Buren, and a Catholic, John Polakowski, all of them have written post-Holocaust theologies, which is wonderful, but what it leads to is an elevation of Zionism and putting our relationships with our Jewish neighbors into a higher realm than justice for the Palestinians and even good relations with our Muslim brothers. So there's a stream that has developed out of post-Holocaust theology that basically elevates the exclusivism of the Jewish people and the matching of Christian exclusivity, which I find very dangerous and problematic and contrary to the gospel. So that's one element of it. Political Zionism in the liberal, in the mainstream, basically says the answer to Jewish suffering is to embrace modern political Zionism in the state of Israel as an answer. And that's partially true. But then when the state that you are embracing is oppressing another people, driving them out of their land, taking their property, and even weakening Christianity, we've got some serious human rights, religious rights, international law problems. Ah, am I there already? Oh, dear. Okay, let me hasten. One more. Mark Ellis, a brilliant, very powerful Jewish theologian, liberation theologian, says, our liberal churches and our mainstream churches are imprisoned by the ecumenical deal. We saw that operating here in Albuquerque in the recent weeks. Don't embrace the liberation narrative of the Palestinians. Don't allow conferences like this to take place, because if you do, it's going to jeopardize your dialogue with your Jewish partners. We saw it in the Presbyterian church, where rabbis get up and say, if you pass a motion on boycott or divestment, you're going to lose your relationship with us. And it's, a lot of people then cave in, as the dean of the cathedral did. And I don't know what was said, but pressure was brought on the cathedral that you are going to be supporting, and they do a nasty little spin. Sabeel is a violent organization that calls for the destruction of Israel. We are really committed to nonviolence.
That's what the senior board does.
Well, but this is how the pressure works. And the pressure comes down that you will lose your relationships and your dialogue. I say these are opportunities for a deeper, more honest dialogue. And we need to stand, and Father Alona did that. He was told not to come to this conference. And here he is. So I thank you. And I truly believe that your dialogue is going to continue with the rabbis and the Jewish Federation, and maybe at a more honest level. And we're going to disagree about a few things. But this is how it works. That's the ecumenical deal. Don't talk about justice for the Palestinians and human rights, and you can have wonderful dialogue. But as soon as you raise that, hey, we may not be able to talk to you anymore. So that's part of the problem. Let me just finish, then we'll take questions. Okay, just a couple more. Yeah. We call this PEPs. Many of these liberal, progressive churches are progressive on everything except Palestine. PEP, progressive except for Palestine. And I think, you know, we have to not really demonize that other side. We need to build relationships, because it's possible, like Migo Pellet, to change. But it's a difficult thing when you got your organization, like the Jewish Federation, telling you what to say, and it's articulating the Netanyahu line. That's very difficult. So we, in a way, have to dialogue and work with our Jewish sisters and brothers who are kind of caught in this. Okay, I'm going to have to just skip some of that. Yeah, we're viewed as anti-Semites and so on. And the Presbyterian Church, we're often seen, and we've worked hard to get some of these motions passed, like boycott, and to challenge Israel's occupation and so on. But we have passed resolutions that Israel has a right to exist, but within secure and defined borders, has got to stop the occupation and the settlement process. When we passed a resolution in 2004 that we are going to consider divesting from U.S. corporations, where my pension is, that invest with the military in the occupation, all hell broke loose. We were then declared anti-Semitic, no longer friends of Israel, because we were challenging this. Now, all these resolutions supporting Israel and Israel's right to exist, even the resolutions against settlements, hey, nobody said anything about those. They were just filed away in a nice little book. Letters were sent off to the State Department and nothing happened. But when it got economic, suddenly people paid attention to us. So this is where things are now. So a lot of these concerns now are in a new form of discourse and dialogue. And there's a paper now being pressed through the Presbyterian system that basically says God gave the land to the Jewish people from a liberal perspective. And it's happening in all the denominations. And we are challenging that from the inside. That is not good theology. It's absolutely heretical to make it an exclusivist theology. God owns the land. And God calls all Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others to share the land and discover a new understanding of God, peace, and justice. But this theology goes against that justice narrative that I believe is in Scripture. So we have our work carved out for us in all the denominations. Well, this fellow, how many watched the Presbyterian General Assembly online? A few of us did. I was there. We were just really hopeful we were going to get the divestment through. We educated the committee, and Jewish Voice for Peace worked hand in hand with us on that. And the committee, which didn't understand this at all, voted over 3-to-1 in favor of divesting from these 5 corporations. Then it came to the floor, and the committee presented it. We thought, sure, with a strong committee support, we would get divestment through the floor. Up popped this guy who had pushed an alternative proposal that says, don't divest, invest in Israel, which sounds wonderful. But basically what that does is you're perpetuating the occupation by doing that, and I can explain that. So he has been leading trips funded by the Jewish Federation and the Jewish Community Relations Council of a one-sided trip of Presbyterian pastors to Israel, seeing one side, and they have a whole movement in the denomination. So that's how it works. That's another example of Christian Zionism at work. And it's really a challenging one for us. But this is part of the debate that we're in.
And they get a tax deduction.
I don't know. They might. I have to skip that. The Christian Century, a liberal organ of opinion, and all kinds of the mainline ecumenical movements, shifted its discourse under pressure from some of the pro-Israel organizations. And now it's hard to get anything in that magazine that talks about justice in a more balanced, I would say, the myth of balance on the other side. Okay, let's go to the last slide. We can come back to this one. Next. Okay. Richard Falk, a Jewish attorney who was appointed by the Obama administration to be the delegate of the UN to monitor what's going on in the occupied territories, wrote this. He said, the biblical mandate for just behavior extends to all humanity, not just to one privileged party. The great Rabbi Hillel teaches, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. The rest is commentary. Now go study. And you might add, go live it. In many Reformed synagogues, this is part of the liturgy on Shabbat. I've experienced it there. It does not mean what is hateful only to another Jew, but it clearly means to encompass every humanity, every part of humanity. So in other words, according to the biblical mandate, everyone is equal, an equal child before God, and we have this responsibility to guard their dignity, not to swallow an exclusive privileging biblical claim to one nation or one race or one religion over another. That's the danger, whether it's progressive, liberal, Christian Zionism, or the fundamentalist. Okay? Let's go to the next one. In the book of Acts, there's a scenario where Jesus is on the Mount of Olives, best view of Jerusalem, by the way, and it says he calls all of his followers before him. And he's about to speak, and a couple disciples pop up and say, Lord, will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? Now if you think about that, it's like saying, well, Jesus, we thought your teachings were great. We really liked the parables. The resurrection was awesome. But now, are you going to do the big one? Give the kingdom to Israel? This was a zealot question. Or you might say, today, a Christian Zionist question. Are you going to privilege Israel over the rest? Jesus must have said, Where have you guys been? How the hell did you get to that kind of a position after all this? And then he says sternly, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons that God has fixed by his authority. Don't make the Bible into a countdown to the end. He opposes that in many places. And don't take sides of one so-called chosen people. We're all chosen before God. He says, but it is for you to be my witnesses. And the root word in the Greek is martyrion. Root word of martyr. Go and live it. Go into the difficult places. And this issue is one of the difficult places. Working in some of our difficult communities, south side of Chicago, and so on. That is being a witness. But applying it to our concern, taking this issue of justice and working nonviolently for a just peace is difficult work. And he says, go and be my witnesses in the difficult places, so-called. Jerusalem, the city that put me to death. Go and proclaim a gospel of love, justice, and truth in these places. That's our calling. So I'll end with this and take some questions. Yeah.
Don, talk about Christian Zionism in the military.
Oh boy. Now, I'm not an expert, but you've got an expert here in Albuquerque, Mikey Weinstein, on that. And I hope we can get him here tomorrow. But it's very, very strong in the military. I know there are Bible studies that are this dispensationalist type. You've got some generals who have been really, at points, reprimanded because they went too far, either in attacking Islam as a pagan religion or on Palestine. And then Mikey Weinstein exposed what's going on that his son had to endure up at the Air Force Academy, where he was called a Christ killer. You know, that's a real evil myth that has to come to an end because he happened to be Jewish. So, you know, I won't say a lot more, but it is very, very strong in the military, unfortunately. And the evangelical fundamentalist form of Christian Zionism often aligns itself closely with the military because it is a very militant form of Christianity.
So is this,
Yeah. Yes.
you mentioned Obama's UN spokesman. Are you saying Obama's on board with this?
No. He said, are you saying Obama's on board with this? I would say Obama is, in a way, he's been betraying his Christian upbringing in a black church in Chicago, where he really came to faith as a community organizer. And and that was kind of a black liberationist, worked with the poor. That's what he got. But I think when he took political office, you know, in the process of the election, remember, he had to denounce his pastor, Jeremiah Wright. So the pressure's on him. And Jeremiah Wright sometimes goes a little far, but he's really solid on justice and on the Palestinian case. Obama knows. But Obama, as a community organizer, is moving always to the middle, I think. And he's been an enormous disappointment on the Palestine question and to the Muslim world. Remember his statement from Cairo raised expectations that we are in a new day. We are going to stand with you and work for justice. And he mentioned a Palestinian state in the Cairo speech. And under pressure from the lobby and those around him, he's backed off. So he's been an enormous disappointment. I don't know what's going to happen if he's reelected.
He'll change. No. Yes, he will.
I don't know.
He will.
Let me just tell you, I thought Clinton would change.
No, Obama will.
Let's hope and pray that's the case.
He will.
Here's the problem he will face. He's elected right away. He and the party have to maintain control of Congress. he will have to work with his opposition to get Democrats elected for Congress. And he'll have to cave in to AIPAC.
Nope.
Then, and this is what Clinton did, then he will have to worry about the next presidential election and get a successor elected. And he'll be forced to compromise. Let's see if he is a man of principle. He knows the difference, but will he act politically with backbone to bring justice to the situation? Let's hope that he does.
So where do the Eastern churches like the
Really good question. Yeah. You notice I did not put the Eastern churches, the Eastern Orthodox, whether it's the Oriental Orthodox like the Coptic and the Assyrians, or the Greek Orthodox, the Antiochians, and all the different Greek Orthodox. I did not mention them as Christian Zionists. They are not. They would not fit either category. Now there are movements of evangelical Christian Zionism in the Antiochian, but they're really minor. So the Antiochians and many of the Greek Orthodox stand for, like Jerusalem, to be an open city for everyone. And they would, by and large, support the Palestinians. And they would support a just solution to the issue. So I did not put them in this category because they don't fit there. And their congregations are filled with Lebanese, Jordanians, Syrians, Palestinians, Egyptian people from that area. So they know. But in many cases, and I see this happen in many of the Antiochian, which is the Arab Chalcedonian church, that they have a very difficult time making a stand for the Palestinians, because the priest will have in his congregation some Lebanese, some Jordanians, who feel that the Palestinian issue may rock the boat and cause division in the church. I think that's the problem a lot of them have. But most of the priests will really support a just solution. Yeah. Thank you. Good question. Back there.
If Christian Zionists believe that this is a fulfillment of prophecy, Israel being...
Yeah. That's the fundamentalist Christian Zionist form.
What do the non-Christian Zionists believe when they read that passage of Scripture? What is their understanding?
Okay. They would say, I just said it briefly before, that God gave this land not to one people, but God owns the land. We are called, and here I think Muslims and Christians and Jews have the same theology. We are called to be stewards of that land, caretakers, not dominators, and no one of us is privileged over the other. And you can follow Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament. Many times, you know, it's even in Leviticus. The Jewish people are called to live Torah. And that means to be caretakers of all humanity equally and honor their dignity and their rights. And in Leviticus 19, there's a verse, if you violate the Torah, the land itself will vomit you out. So what happens, you know, there even is in the Hebrew Scriptures some texts that would lend themselves to Jews having claim to the land as a chosen people. But that's not what the whole sweep of Scripture says. And I say what's happening is that many, and this will happen to anyone, Muslims and Christians could be guilty of this. If you think that you are chosen above others, and that you have exclusive privilege, and you can do whatever you want in terms of security or domination of others, or kill, covet, and take the land, you are falling into idolatry.
Sounds like America.
Well, hey, we can apply all this right here at home, yeah. That you are then violating God's commandments. And you will have to learn the hard way that the land is not the primary thing, nor your security, but living the covenant and living faithfully. So this is and there's much more I could say, but I think that the danger is always idolatry. And there's a wonderful text, I think it's 1 Kings 19. King Ahab walks out and he sees a beautiful vineyard and farm, and he covets it. Says, I want this. He comes back and laments to Jezebel, the queen, says, oh, I wish I had that vineyard. And Jezebel says, well, take it. Now, he had a little bit of conscience and knew he couldn't take it as king, because he would be breaking Torah. So Jezebel has some people accuse Naboth, the poor farmer who owned it, of blaspheming the king and the queen. And he's killed. And then Ahab takes the land. The prophet comes and says, you have broken the covenant. You have violated the law. And the king cannot even do this. And before the end of the day, it's graphic, the dogs will come and lick the blood from your wounds. In other words, you will die as a result of committing this injustice. But what that's saying is he has committed idolatry, broken covenant, privileged himself. And that text is prophetic. The prophet comes and warns him, you have broken the covenant. That's our role now. We stand in the state of, in the path of that prophet and the many others who correct that false theology. And read the prophets. The prophets have this consistently. Micah, Amos, and the rest. So that is, I think, there's another narrative in Scripture. And that's what we got to get to. The Kairos document gets us there. And that's what our Sabeel work is all about. We just had our leadership conference, and we had over 90 people come on their own dime to Portland to work for 4 days. Ann Franklin, who is the chair of our development committee, is back here. We worked for 3 or 4 days on what our priority should be now as a movement in this new challenging period. And I was surprised and gratified that